Fitz, I love this mug you sent me.
I'm glad you like it. It was the biggest handle I had.
Look, you told me, so you gave me a mug in January when I was in Chicago and saw you, and you said, hey, put this in your hand and feel it. And it was literally the first time anybody had ever said that I should think about how a mug fits in my hand. And I didn't I'd never considered it before. I'd always just bought the mug that had the picture on it that I wanted. And I was absolutely heartbroken when I dropped a bowl on it a few months ago and it broke. So I was stoked to get a fresh big handle bad boy here with a lovely blue glaze. So
a lot of potters hate handles. They hate making them because they can be tricky. And I always, when I first started, focused on form. I focused on like what looks pretty or has a nice negative space or whatever, and never really thought about like how it felt in my hand. And then I was studying under this potter a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and she's like, all right, we're going to do handles. We're going to make handles for an hour straight and just attach them to a bucket, like just do anything to keep making handles. And I think I made 43 handles in an hour. Like wow. I just motored through them, and you could clearly look at the first 5 were just garbage, but the last 5 were just like, yeah, it's starting to get there. Kind of neat. And then I started to think about like really what makes it feel like it's hugging your fingers.
The mug hugs your fingers. Welcome to Brad and Will Made a Tech Pod. I'm Will. Brad, unfortunately, well, he's here. He's listening, but he had some surgery this week, and his head is packed full of gauze. So rather than talk to us and make us hear the horrible non-dulcet tones of Brad's gauze-packed nose, I'm here with my pal Brian Fitzpatrick of Tock, but formerly of Google and a bunch of other stuff that we'll get to. And we're going to talk about some old technology. Fitz, welcome to the show. Hello.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you. Good to catch up a little.
If you're a longtime listener to Still Untitled, you've heard me talk about an event that happens in Chicago in January called ORD Camp that Fitz, along with a team of really, really brilliant people, has been running for what, like 12 years now?
12 years. We've done 12 of them. Yeah.
Yeah. And it is the event that he runs is a collection of brilliant, interesting, fascinating, fun people that come together and kind of share the things that they're interested and passionate about. And it's a really incredible cross-disciplinary event. And it's one of my favorite things that I get to do when I get to go. So thank you for that. But you've also been doing technology stuff for you're one of the fabled graybeards, Fitz. I don't want to out you.
Yeah, no worries. I've been doing this for 26 years now. Yeah.
You started with one of the early code management systems, right?
Well, I started before that. I mean, I that was sort of the thing that helped me, I think, really get out there. I was doing open source stuff, I did work on Subversion when it first started in 2000, and Subversion launched in 2003. I have not been using Subversion for longer than it's actually existed, which is kind of funny. Not for longer, for longer than I actually used it. But yeah, no, I started doing CGI programming with Perl back in 94.
Oh, wow.
When it was like, Mosaic and Netscape had just come out. And I don't know, I just loved it. I think at a late start, though. I didn't start till I was 24.
Oh, what? So were you like a CS guy?
No, I majored in Latin, minored in Greek, and pottery.
Wow.
So my mom thought I was going to be homeless.
I mean, it worked out okay for you, I guess.
Always have a hobby.
That's funny. I did Latin and ancient Greek, and those contributed to me being able to write really well.
Yeah,
because you can't like you're not going to do well at Latin if you don't doing well at Aladdin makes you really, really, really understand English grammar in a way that is fascinating. I always found. But yeah, so you worked on Subversion, which was I guess we could explain what Subversion is, but it's basically a predecessor to Git, or one of the more modern code management systems at this point, right?
I'd agree. Yeah, it was a centralized version control system built to replace CVS, which was the original like open source version control system that everyone used back in the 90s and 2000s, up until Subversion basically supplanted that, and then Git supplanted that. So yeah,
and then that took you to Google, right?
Yeah. I started at Google, I don't know, a year and a half after Subversion launched. Mm-hmm. And
you were part of a crowd that seemed like they didn't want to move to California, but wanted to work for Google, and you ended up somehow staying in Chicago.
Yes, somehow. I don't know how that worked out. That was kind of fascinating. I basically said, yeah, I'm staying here and I'd love to work for Google. And we wound up with me starting Google's engineering office in Chicago, along with my friend Ben, who you know very well.
Yeah, I love Ben. Ben's great. Yeah. And Google. So when we get to Google, we're going to get to the interesting part. I think the really interesting part of the story, because Google in addition to like day job stuff that you did, you started the takeout, what is now I think called the Google Takeout program, which lets you extract all of your data from the giant faceless multinational tech company, so that you can move it to other places or whatever. But I mean that initiative, when I was at Maximum PC when you all started doing that, and I saw that, I was like, oh, this is something I had never thought these enormous tech companies were going to allow. And it kind of set a really positive tone for data portability in a way that, like, Google was giving us all these free services. There was no need for Google to release the data that we'd given to Google, right? So it was a refreshing thing. And I'm curious, like, that process, how much of that was, like, how much of a fight was it to get that to happen inside the company at the time? Were people on board, or was it a challenge?
It was actually effortless, insofar as I basically went to Eric Schmidt at the time and said, hey, I really want to do this thing. And he's like, well, why are you asking me permission? Just go, you should be doing this. Of course you should be doing this, because he had been one of the things there are two things that inspired me to start it. One was Eric kept giving talks internally and externally where he talked about the fact that Google doesn't lock in your data. Mm-hmm. Like other companies, where it's impossible to get your data out or export it, we make it easy to go. And I sort of thought, like, yeah, we kind of do. The door's open, but in some cases, you really got to bang your shoulder up against it. And I think it could be better. And then I wound up having a conversation. There's a long story behind this, but due to an article about me in Valleywag that misquoted me, I met this Google PM named Jess, who was the one that initially threw the idea about the data liberation project. She called it data portability, and we were just getting ready to roll it out. And then dataportability.org came out, and I looked at this and I'm like, this is never going to go anywhere. And this was like 2008, 2009. And so we decided to go data liberation, sort of like guerrilla army type marketing. And I'm glad we did, because dataportability.org is still there, and it's still sort of hasn't done a whole lot, frankly.
Well, it's if you've never used the takeout service, it's really neat. You go in, you log into your Google account, and then you say, okay, I want to download all of this stuff. And it says, okay, we're going to zip this up and we'll let you know when the download's ready. And then you get, you can get everything from like email, stuff that's uploaded to photos, stuff that's uploaded to YouTube,
your blog, anything.
Yeah. All of it. And it works.
The really cool thing about it is we initially launched with Zip because that was the easiest thing to get done and build the pipeline. But now you can point your stuff straight at Dropbox. You can push your stuff right at Microsoft OneDrive. And Google started the data transfer project in the last, year and a half, 2 years ago, which is an open source project to allow anyone basically to build an endpoint for takeout, not just for takeout, but for this sort of protocol of transferring data from one place to the other, so that it doesn't turn into a technology problem to integrate with other services. It turns into basically a sort of a procedural problem where you vet the service and make sure that they're legit before you hook up to them.
That's so. I guess shortly after that, you left Google, right? Or maybe other stuff in between.
6 years after that, after we started it, yeah.
But along the way, you also, one of my favorite things at ORD Camp every year is you take a lunchtime Saturday tour of the Chicago Google Museum, which is a little nook on one of the floors in the Google office. I can't remember which one, but it's got all this weird science and tech ephemera from the Chicago. It seems like it's mostly from the Chicago area, but also from like Google's history and a bunch of other things. And there's some stuff there that I've never seen in actual like real museums. For example, there's an old, I think you said second generation Google rack, maybe.
Yeah, there's second generation rack. A first generation rack is in the Computer Science History Museum. Or Computer History Museum in Mountain View, right by Google.
Okay.
I tried to get one of those, but they don't ship. They fall apart because they're literally held together with zip ties.
So those are the ones that when we would hear stories about Google engineers building machines and stacking them on, I think, what was it, pieces of like particle board or something?
It was cork board. They call them the cork board racks, the first generation, because they would just basically had these sort of bits of sheet metal, and they would put a thin layer of cork board on just basically to keep the motherboard from shorting out against the metal rack.
Yeah, and they're not screwed in. They're just rested and zip tied in the corner holes, right?
They weren't even zip tied. They were just rested on there. The back wall of the rack was a zip tied together wall of fans, basically. Wow. And the whole thing was just like, it's just super, super sketch. If you're ever in the museum in Mountain View, go check it out. You're like, it's sort of canted a little bit to the side because it's like going to fall over at any moment.
Well, it reminds me of I can't remember it's the people in one of the Douglas Adams books that the supercomputer is pushing spaceflight on, and they build the jankiest spaceship in the world, in the universe. And you look at it and everybody's like, I can't believe this thing flew. And you kind of look at those old racks and you're like, this is what made search good. I don't know if I buy this.
Well, I mean, there's a couple things that were groundbreaking for that. First of all, they didn't have pretty bezels. They didn't have blinking lights. Everyone didn't have a CD drive. Everyone didn't have all these, all this stuff that you expected in a server. And also, they weren't designed to be sturdy and last. The premise was hardware will fail no matter what, especially as you get into larger numbers. So let's just plan on it failing and go as cheap as we can. The other thing was they were optimizing for square footage and the use of electricity. Because at the time, in late 90s, early 2000s, data centers were charging you per square foot, not per watt used. And so by maximizing this, and then by the time Google got to second gen rack, which is the one that I have in the museum here, they were still renting data center space at the time instead of building their own data centers. But the really cool thing is they would roll all these racks into a data center, and they would use so much electricity and cooling that half the data center would be left empty.
Wow.
Because they just couldn't put anything else in there.
So like you guys they were trying to build Comtronium basically there rather than. Brad asks, what kind of systems are we talking about in those zip tied racks? Architecture, OS, stuff like that.
Well, it was all basically a version of Linux. I don't know about the Gen 1 rack, but the Gen 2 rack that I have was dual Pentium 3s, and they were just like. They had two different kinds of racks. Okay, so let me back up a second. So I decided I wanted to get a rack for the office. The whole reason this museum thing exists is because I was like, we're out in Chicago. We should have cool nerd stuff like they have out in Mountain View. Because in Mountain View Building 42, they had a first gen rack in the lobby, and they've got all this sort of cool stuff out there. And I'm like, there's no reason we shouldn't have this here. So you remember early days, Google had this thing called the Geo Display, which was this rotating earth with little pillars of light showing where searches were happening. So I built one of those machines and had that in the office, which was cool. And then I'm like, we need to get a rack. And so I tried to get the Gen 1 rack and failed because they just said, we can't ship them. They'll fall apart. Then I managed to sort of weasel my way into getting a Gen 2 rack shipped. And so there's two of them. One is what they call a serving rack, which it would have 40 machines, 20 per side. And it was basically CPU, just for serving up search queries, handling whatever types of data adds, et cetera. Then they had a rack that they affectionately called a disk full rack because it was full of disks that was for storage. And so the one that I wound up getting was a disk full rack, and that's 40 machines. Each machine's a Pentium 3, dual Pentium 3, and each machine had 8 hard disks in it. Now, there were originally 20 megabyte hard disks, and they all like plugged into these little offboard daughter cards. At some point,
hold on, 20 megabyte or 20 gigabyte disks?
I'm sorry.
It would have had to be 20 gigabyte, right?
No, this was early 2000s.
So
this was 2003 era. So I don't know that would have been 20, but it would have been 20 gigabyte.
Yeah, 20 megabyte would have been like mid 90s.
Yeah, 20 megabyte would have. See, this is
early 90s. Maybe.
This is the problem with starting like with computers in the 80s is that like I get my megabytes and gigabytes confused all the time.
It's easy to be off by an order of magnitude on the reg. Yeah.
Yeah. So 20 gigabyte disks, and Google was desperate for storage space because they were running out of space to store logs. So at some point they went through and converted all these to 400 gigabyte drives. And as you well know, the problem with making your basement 20 times larger, but still having the same wee little basement door gave you all sorts of IO problems. and these racks were legendary for just being super difficult to get data into and off of. But that's the rack that we have at Google Chicago. And the cool thing about it is I was so ignorant going into this. I had no idea how much this thing weighed.
Yeah, each there's 40 machines and each one has 8 hard drives. So that's 320 hard drives.
Yes. And you've got the rack and you've got all the other metal and stuff. The weight of this rack is just under 1,500 pounds. And so the delivery guy showed up and he was super confused. He's like, where's the data center? And I'm like, oh, there's no data center. This is just an office. He's like, I can't deliver this. I'm like, why not? He's like, well, your ramp has a 1-inch lip at the bottom and we can't get over that. And I'm like, well, can't you just tilt it back? And he just looked at me like I had 3 heads. And we wound up somehow not killing ourselves with like 7 or 8 people getting this rack up and rolling it down the hallway to where it lived. And it was one of those things where it was running a standing wave through the floor of the office because it was so heavy.
Oh my God.
When the building management people found out what I brought into the building, they were furious because the building wasn't rated for this. And so we wound up having to literally like put it right next to a load bearing column, couldn't move it, had all these rules and restrictions around it.
It's a good thing you're in earthquake territory, I guess.
Right.
Is there anywhere online people can see pics of this stuff? Like, are these available online places, or are they still kind of semi-secret?
I don't think they're semi-secret. I think if you start, this was also known as a breadboard rack because it looked like giant, breadboards, these big metal sheets that were in there. And so I bet you if you search around for Google breadboard rack, you could find something. Okay. Or rather, they're just super ghetto looking, especially now that it's a 17-year-old piece of hardware. And it's another funny story about this. I actually created a sticker that I wound up giving out like 30,000 of at Google that said my other computer is a data center.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I say this sticker was, lots of people would use it. My other computer is a book. The security team made my other computer is your computer, and the hardware ops people made my other computer is made of razor blades and hate. Because these machines had so many sharp edges that they were required to wear gloves after a while to handle them because people were just getting their fingers sliced to ribbons.
I was going to say, I looked at this and it reminded me of the worst of the 90s PC cases in that it is like the die stamped metal with the super sharp edges. This is before the point. I mean, now obviously Google buys enough hardware that they just say, hey, this is the giant motherboard manufacturer. Here's the motherboard we want with this stuff on it and this configuration, this many slots and this many drive ports and all of that stuff. But back then, I assume this was mostly off the shelf hardware or not really. Yeah.
Completely off the shelf, bulk stock crap. And there was a switch built into the middle of the rack too. So everything basically just plugged into there. You would roll in and basically plug in 3 or 4 things into the wall and then plug in one Ethernet cable and off you went. So you can turn up a data center really quickly and burn it in really quickly. There's 2 other things that merit note about this rack. And one was very controversial, is that all the drives were just basically, instead of screwing them all in, because drives fail all the time, especially when you have hundreds of thousands of them, they were all Velcroed down. And go ahead.
I was just saying, mechanical hard drives of that time didn't have accelerometers and stuff if they were jostled. So, like moving the rack when it was, I guess moving a 1,500-pound rack was probably challenging. So,
right. I mean, well, you obviously wouldn't bump it around a lot, but and that the heads would be parked when it was moving, and you wouldn't move it when it was on. But there were two things that were interesting. One is that software engineers were like, "Oh, this is fine. These racks, these drives can handle this sort of vibration, et cetera, without being mounted, screwed down." Well, it turned out they would do fine on reads, but on writes they would fail like 50% of the time because of the vibrations, and it just got worse as they added more drives. So, eventually the hardware engineers did the "I told you so" thing. The other thing fun to note about this is that these racks were just so poorly built and so much slammed out so quickly that it was sometimes very difficult to get the lower servers pushed in because the machine the sides would bow in or out. And so the documented protocol for getting the last bottom machine back in all the way was to lay on your back in front of it and kick it until it went in. Seriously.
The early days of tech, pretty janky, it turns out. What was the, like, how many of these are we talking about? Like, were these things that they were just building as fast as they could and there were tens of thousands of them eventually? Or was this something that there were a few hundred of and and that was all that was needed to run the Google of the time?
I'd say it's somewhere between those two, or I don't know the exact number, but it was definitely in the 5 digits range at least. I mean, 4 to 5 digits.
And then they transitioned to building custom enclosures and custom racks so that they could increase the density even more. And now we're looking at like 4 U's with 32 CPUs and a bazillion drives and all that stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, everything now is super custom, including the data centers themselves. Like they're really amazing. I've been to some cool places. I've been inside the Fermi Lab Tevatron. I've been to Argonne National Labs Electron Accelerator, and I've been in a Google data center. And the last generation that was there when I left in 2014 blew my mind. Absolutely blew my mind.
The science of how can we pack more compute into the smallest amount of space and cooling footprint has been really, it's gone a lot of places in the last 20 years, right?
Sure has. Yeah, it's all about electricity at that point. That's generally your limiting factor.
Well, yeah, there's a reason we build them in places where there's a lot of hydroelectric power or a lot of sun and a lot of cool water, right?
Right. Yeah, there's one in Finland, I think.
Yeah, I know that there's a bunch on like the Columbia River in Oregon and Washington, places like it's like what are the other things that matter for data centers? I guess speed of light, so distance to the places that you need the resources, or does that even matter really?
Intersection of electricity and good fiber is basically it. But yeah, I mean that's the reason I used to. When I would do tours of the office, and especially with school students, I would ask them, like, why do you think Google has data centers all the way around the world? And they would come up with a lot of different answers, but no one ever got the right answer, which is that the light isn't fast enough. Yeah. So if everything's in North America, people halfway around the globe, you're adding, a 1/7 of a second to everything, which is a lot.
Wait, when the search query takes a 1/3 of a 1/6 of a second, then a 1/7 of a second lag is a lot, right?
Everything starts to add up. Yeah.
Let's switch tracks a little bit and talk. One of the other things that's fascinating about the Google Museum is you have a very large electromagnet there.
I do. It's very large, yellow, 850-pound superconducting electromagnet. Everyone should have one.
Yeah. So it's an electromagnet. It's from the Tevatron, right?
That's right. The Fermilab Tevatron. Yeah.
Which was
a high-speed experiment to find particles, right? I mean, it was not high speed, high energy. High energy, thank you. Yeah, high energy physics. Yeah, that was worked on for years, if not decades. Yeah.
I was just going to say, particle accelerator in the Chicagoland area at Fermilab. And this thing, the stand, I don't know if you guys built the stand or if they built the stand, but the table for it is pretty impressive.
I bought the stand.
Oh, you bought the stand. Okay.
Yeah. It's rated for 34,000 pounds. So I bought one. Let's back up. We should talk about how we got it, right? So on September 30th, 2011, they shut down the Tevatron because they have the Large Hadron Collider now. An interesting note, Fermi did a lot of the magnet research and a lot of the magnet R&D for the LHC because they were the ones with the expertise. So anyway, it was announced that it was shut down, and I immediately emailed a friend of mine that worked over there, and I'm like, dude, it's the Fermi Lab Tevatron shut down. Can you get me a magnet from it? And he wrote me back, and I don't know, can we swear on this podcast?
Yeah, fuck yeah.
He's like, you have no fucking idea what you're asking for. And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, they're huge. I'm like, well, get me a small one. And so I have a small one that's 850 pounds and 4 feet long. The large ones are multiple tons and like 20 to 40 feet long, something very long. But there's two kinds of magnets in the Tevatron. One is a steering magnet, which is basically, it's a dipole, has 2 poles, and basically turns the beam a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right as it goes around this mile long ring, or mile diameter. I think it might be mile.
I think it's mile
diameter.
Circumference.
Is it mile circumference? It's big, whatever it is. I mean, it's so big they have buffalo or bison living in the middle of it, right?
The comments will let us know.
Yeah. And then the small ones are quadrupoles. They're focusing magnets. There's 4 poles. They basically squeeze the beam down every so often as it goes around. There's about 774 of the dipoles in the ring, and then there's 250 of the quadrupoles. And so in any case, my friend, he humored me, and we went back and forth, and basically just over a year later, I got the magnet. Like, it had to go through so much red tape and everything. And I bought it off of eBay. That's how I got it. They called me up and they said, we finally figured this out. How do you want to buy it? I said, what is easiest for you? And they said, really, eBay's the easiest. And I said, well, can you make it a buy it now? Because I don't want someone else to snatch this up. Because they had to go all this thing where they had to put it up for scrap. I mean, no one bought it for scrap. Like, no one would buy it. And so I clicked the buy it now button off of eBay and had it shipped to the office. I bought a table for it that was rated for 1 ton. And I'm like, I figured 2x the rating, that'll be totally fine. And this table wobbled back and forth so much, it scared the heck out of our facilities people. And like, you need to buy a bigger, better table. So the table we have now is like 350 pounds, and you could park, a truck on it. It's bananas.
I have to ask how much an 800-pound Tevatron magnet costs on Buy It Now on eBay.
Well, so when I said, can they do Buy It Now, they sort of did this sort of sucking in their teeth. We're gonna have to raise the price a good bit if you put it on Buy It Now. And I said, well, okay, what is the price going to be with Buy It Now? And they said it's going to be $150.
You're paying less than a buck a pound. That's pretty good.
It's basically a scrap price, but only 2 of these magnets have ever left Fermi. One's at the Smithsonian, I believe it's in storage, and this one is on display at the museum in Google Chicago.
So Brad wants to know: is it safe to assume you've never tried to put power on the magnet?
It is very safe to assume that, because for 2 reasons. One, we don't have that kind of power. 2. We don't have liquid helium to cool it. So,
oh man,
it's
always a problem. It turns out, the liquid helium.
Yeah, and it's got these cool sort of bendy connectors on the side where they use to connect everything together. And you can look down the beam line. It's really an amazing piece of high energy physics history, and I'm super happy to have that. But yeah, there was some concern about people, is it going to affect laptops or phones walking by and that kind of thing? And you're like, no, it's basically a giant hunk of iron at this point. Although the magnet itself is inside the iron yoke is niobium titanium.
You don't want to degauss every credit card in the building when you fire that thing up. I think that you said the one that you have wasn't actually ever, it was a spare. Is that right? Yeah,
it was a spare. The as my contact at Fermilab put, you're never going to remove any magnet from the Tevatron itself because they are imbued with administratium, which is to say there's so much red tape involved in getting something out of there because basically they're hot, having been, shot through with protons, high-speed protons for so many years. There's a low level of radiation in them.
Okay.
So this was a spare, and they cleaned it all up and they repainted it and they re-stenciled it, and so it's all pretty when we got it. But I had to buy an engine hoist to move it off of the pallet onto the thing, because how do you move something that heavy,
So I mean, somewhere at Google Chicago, there's an engine hoist just rolling around in a back storage room.
That is correct.
Very good. Did you have all this stuff in the old Google office before they moved to the new place?
Yeah, the old space, was the one that had the problem with the weight of the rack. The new space building is in an old cold storage building. You could park cars in there; it's no problem.
Okay, that makes more sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the other things that's really fascinating about the space in Google, and there's a bunch more stuff we could get into, but your collection of esoteric storage devices there has some stuff that I'd never seen before, which is I mean, look, I've been doing this for a little bit. And you have everything from like old analog formats going all the way back to early record cylinders and things like phonograph cylinders and things like that, all the way up to micro cassettes and weird disc formats. I think there's a German phonograph tape thing that's in there somewhere.
Yeah, the Teffy phone. Yeah.
That one is the weirdest because it seems like it's a vinyl tape, right? Like a kind of thick vinyl tape.
Yeah.
In a cartridge.
Read by a needle. Yeah. It's the weirdest thing ever. And but it's a beautiful red vinyl, whatever type of plastic type of thing. I don't know what it is, but yeah, it's pretty cool. Yeah.
That one, I assume you have to rewind. It's a record you have to rewind, but I don't know for sure.
No, I don't think so. I think it's like an 8-track. I think it's got like a loop.
I don't know how 8-tracks. So 8-tracks is another one of those ones I never bothered to spend the 20 minutes on Wikipedia to figure out how it works. What are the more interesting, like, I mean, obviously there's like zip disks and SideQuest disks and all those big external hard drive things in there. But what are some of do you have some highlights, some favorites from that section, Fitz?
Yeah. So the Teffy phone is by far one of my favorites. I love that idea. I love the film collection because I've got everything from 8mm to 35 to 70 and then to IMAX. That I think I let you pick up that IMAX trailer that I've got. It's like a 30-second IMAX trailer that weighs 15 pounds.
It's a disc. It's a disc of celluloid that is
it's Mylar.
Mylar, because celluloid would have caught on fire by now, probably. It's really, really heavy. And like, it's really fun when you have people and everybody's holding up the different sizes of the film. It's really nice it gives you a really firm representation of, hey, here's the difference in, everything from, like you said, home 8mm all the way through the IMAX and the CinemaScope and all the different projection formats. Yeah.
And to give you a feeling for like what you're talking about, take your pinky fingernail and look at it. That's about the size of an 8mm frame. So you can hold that up to the light and you can maybe make out if it's a person or a house or something. The IMAX frame is hold your phone up, hold your extra large phone up, which I have one. That's probably 2 frames side by side of IMAX right there. So you can not only tell what's in it, but who's in it. Like there's one of the frames I got is Robin Williams on a horse. And you can clearly see it's Robin Williams standing on a horse because it's just that big. And there's just that much resolution there.
Yeah, the IMAX is almost like it's like the size of your palm almost, depending on how big your hands are.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Go ahead.
I was going to say the other, going way back, the giant digital disc pack that I've got, it's 175 megabytes. I think it's 12 or so 14-inch platters, and it weighs in the order of 40 pounds. And this was the other thing, they would go and put in those giant dishwasher size disk drives in a data center, and you'd spin the top off and you close the lid of the dishwasher and the heads come in from the side and read the data off of it.
Those things looked like a tub washer, really.
Yeah, they're just enormous.
We did a video at Tested years ago with one of the, I guess it's one of the things that followed that, but that IBM, I want to say it's like a 2 megabyte hard drive or something from the 60s that Adam got someplace. When we hung that from the ceiling in his shop, it took 3 people and a chain hoist to get it up there. And I feel like it was in the early days of us working with Adam at Tested, and I was standing there with this 80 or 100 pound disk drive on my shoulder, on my hands up above my head, and I was thinking, man, I hope his ceiling joists are as strong as he said they are, because otherwise I'm going to get flattened here.
That was the first thing I thought when he pointed it out to me when I was over there a couple of years ago. I was like, oh man. Yeah, I mean, that was big data, right? This stuff was heavy. but like the whole point around this was collecting things that for storing data over the years, because so many people collected old machines, but like that gets really bad really quickly, like as in like build a warehouse because it's just so big. So as I sort of like went forward and backward, different folks would send me different things. Different folks would recommend stuff. I've got a deck of punch cards, which is really cool. Like I just adore punch cards because I grew up with them because my dad did computer stuff and they were everywhere in our house. They were for grocery lists. You know, you could cut them into strips and make little chains of like decoration, all sorts of stuff.
My grandparents' house had that as well. My grandmother worked on early punch card stuff in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So.
It was so interesting. It was so tangible, you know? A million different kinds of tapes. Tapes, I think, is the most obnoxious category because, and I will back up and say, when I started doing this, I started collecting this because I'm like, oh, this is a nice finite thing to collect. I was wrong.
Yeah.
It is absolutely infinite because there's so much
formats.
Yes. So there's so many different really weird not broadly used formats out there, like the Teffy phone, you know, they probably made 1,000 or a couple thousand of those, I'd guess, you know.
Well, and especially in the early days of computing, there were so many people who had shifted from making, so many companies that shifted from making analog tape stuff to digital tape stuff. There were probably, I remember at one point in the 90s, I was speccing out a backup system for our server cluster at the place I was working. And like there were probably 20 different vendors making completely incompatible tape backup systems.
Oh, yeah.
Like that could hold anywhere from maybe 1 gig to 10 gigs per tape or something like that.
Yeah.
And that stuff could get out of control. The disc, the hero of the disc, different disc formats is a fun part of your thing. You know, I did notice you didn't have one of those little like Pocketzip discs. I don't know if you remember those, but they were like maybe 40 or 80 megs. They were mostly for MP3 players, and they were like 2 inches across, maybe 1.5 inches across. I think they only ever made one device that played them.
A removable zip?
It was a removable zip for portable use. I might have one in the garage that I can bring out next time I see you. So
yeah, I've never actually been aware of those. So I've got a spreadsheet that I should share this with you. That's got a list of all the known formats or particular types that I have, so that folks can go through and be like, oh yeah, I have that, or add to it or remove from it. You know, that's how Rob Pike, actually, I was having dinner with him years ago, and we were talking about this, and he was like, oh, do you have a 12-inch worm disc in there? I'm like, wait, a what? Because I've got an optical, I've got a 3 1/4, or 3.5 and a 5 1/4. I didn't know they made a 12, but I found one, and it's like a laser disc in a cartridge. It's amazing.
Wow.
Yeah. They're huge.
That's bonkers. I guess it still fits in a rack, right?
Yeah.
The audio cassettes, the scale at which Sony made audio cassettes from very, very tiny, like spy tape size, all the way up to what's the big one, like 5 inches across or something? Oh,
it's at least 5. Yeah, it's 5, 6, something like that. It's just enormous.
Yeah,
it's like,
but it looks like a normal.
Tape. Yeah,
it looks like a micro cassette, but it's just huge. So
yeah, and the fun ones, again, it comes down to like weight and size. So I've got the tiny little micro cassettes, which are smaller than the ones people are familiar with. Sony made this itty bitty one that's like 1 inch across. And then, you know, we've got the reel to reel stuff, got a 1/4 inch. I don't actually have 1/2 inch. I don't know. I've got the 9-track tape, which is all the old spinny tapes you'd see in the old Datacenter pictures, early original Tron, you know, type stuff like that. And then I've got 1-inch mastering tape. And then my favorite 2-inch mastering tape. It's basically for 24-track analog recording. It's the kind of stuff that the Beatles, like, you know, recorded on in the very towards the end, the Abbey Road days. But this stuff, it's just so heavy. It's this, you know, 10-inch reel that weighs like 15 pounds or something.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, it's when you think about the density of data storage, what's happened to the density of data storage over the last 20 years and the cost at the same time. Like I the other day I had to buy a 128 gig micro SD card. It's smaller than my pinky nail. It holds 128 gigabytes. And I think I paid $20 for it, $25 for it, maybe.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, it's amazing.
Well, that's the thing that I point out to folks is I've got this display at Google with all this stuff in it and a whole lot more. We've only really scratched the surface of it, but you could basically put all of this onto a single drive that you could go out and buy commercially today.
And I think there's the space is limited that you have for the museum there, but there's a fascinating, like, you know how they present paleontological displays at natural history museums now, and they show the bones through time, so you understand that the Tyrannosaurus and the Brontosaurus didn't live at the same time period because they were separated by 30 million years or whatever.
Right.
There's an argument that like there'd be a neat way to put all that stuff on a timeline so you can actually see it and see what happened to the data density and the cost and the weight and all that over the the 40 years that stuff has been made. I think
I'd love to do something like that. That's a great idea.
I think that's a pretty good place to wrap it up, Fitz. If you unless you have well, let's see, what did we do? Oh, I got some questions coming in from Brad. Hot text questions from Brad. He's typing.
Well, while he's typing, I'll throw a couple of other interesting things on there. We got in the museum. One is so we got laser discs, which people have probably seen somewhere. It's like a 12-inch CD, right? We also have capacitance electronic disc, which is a predecessor to the laser disc that used a very fine needle, like a record, for tracking. But the problem is that they couldn't get any dust in there because it was the needle track was so fine. So RCA put them in a case, a sleeve. So you would stick this long sleeve into the front of this reader and then pull it out, and it would sort of grab the disc.
And with the sleeve, did it have brushes to brush dust off as it was going in?
It did. It had a gentle little linear brush at the end of it to sort of keep the dust out. But they still got dust in them and got destroyed.
So this is a little bit of a swerve back to the start of the conversation, but you said you considered it a late start, that you only got into coding at age 24. This is from Brad, by the way.
Yeah.
What would you say to someone who's developing an interest in the subject past the age of 40?
Go for it. I don't think anything is too late. I mean, I got a late start relative to most people that write software. Most of the people I hire today are just out of college or whatever not, and they've been doing it since high school. People are starting to write code. It's more accessible for people to not only write code but get the resources to learn about it. Like in '94, when I was first starting all this, it was like save up money to buy an O'Reilly book.
Yeah.
Now it's just use Google and Stack Overflow and you're halfway there, right? For writing code.
Yeah, and before Linux, if you wanted to code, you had to save money to buy your environment to write code and compile in, right?
To buy a compiler, yeah. So I would say that I don't think anyone's too old to learn it. Just if there's something you're interested in or curious about, start digging in and find something you want to build. Just or find some way of learning that works best for you. I'm not a classroom learner. I'm a sort of hacker type of person. People would say I'm self-taught, but I say that I went out and found a bunch of teachers when it came to this stuff. So if that's what works for you, go for it. If you're a classroom learner, take a class, buy a book, whatever works for you. But I don't think there's any too late anywhere around learning how to program.
Do you does it matter what language? What you start, I know, I learned to code. I took CS 100 when I was in college and was like, oh, this probably isn't for me. And then 20 years later, I got an Arduino kit, and that knowledge translated straight ahead into how to write code for Arduinos. But also at the same time, there was something really satisfying to me about making a change on my computer that could affect something physical in the world, like turn a motor, light up a light, make a buzz sound, whatever it was. And that made it a lot easier for me to get going. But I know a lot of people teach Swift. A lot of people teach learn Python now. Where would you recommend starting, or do you think it matters?
I think a lot of it depends on what your interests are. To your point, you found the interaction between software and the physical world interesting, and that sparked your interest, which is great. Then Arduino is definitely the way to go with that. When I was a kid, I had an Apple IIc, and my brother and I learned basics, some 6502 assembler, and then I got a Mac, and I learned some Pascal and a tiny little bit of C. But it never really grabbed me. There was something about the client side stuff that I wasn't interested in. When my little snot-nosed brother back, who was in college at the time studying engineering, he introduced me to Unix and Perl, and that was my gateway drug. That was the thing that caught because I was writing something that I could affect on a web page that would just go out there and other people could see. I thought that got me excited. So what is the thing that gets you excited? I will say, I think you could make a mistake if you started doing x86 assembler, you're probably going to quit before you get anywhere. So, I think Python's a great thing. I think Arduino's great. I think things that are easier, I would avoid compiled languages, frankly. I wouldn't start with C or Java. Start with something that can get you a return on investment pretty quickly. The reason I think Perl worked really great for me is because Larry Wall was a classicist. I was also a classicist, so I could learn Perl much like I had learned Latin, Greek, or Italian. And it was like little bits at a time, speak like baby Perl and then get adolescent Perl and then et cetera. So, find what works for you.
Well, and now everybody has, like, it's funny. Somebody asked me once what they should do. Like, what do they need to buy anything? I was like, maybe a second monitor. Because it turns out almost all of the programmers I know now almost always have like the complete reference guide up on the left side on their other monitor, because when you're dealing with these more complex languages now, there's a lot to keep in your head, and you need to think about how the algorithms work, not necessarily the syntax or whatever of what you're working on in all cases. So there's nothing wrong with having that second monitor open with your code examples and your reference guides and all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a mistake to think that people who have been coding for many, many years just remember everything and just sit down and start typing something out like that right out of their head. Absolutely not. Like, I still forget, like, what is a particular function to do something? What are the order of arguments? What's this magic number? Yada, yada, yada. Reference is the way it goes. Like, look, I pulled up. Go ahead.
I've seen Swordfish. I know how coding works. Okay.
Oh God.
What's the worst movie representation of programming you've ever seen?
Oh, I don't know. I really don't know. Like, it's not I can't pick out one particular movie because it's usually just the silly stuff when something goes wrong and I hit a bug and like the keyboard sparks. Like, that's probably the thing that's, or the other thing is when I was at Apple, we were creating these widgets for web stuff that we could reuse. And one of the ones one of my colleagues created was called the Hollywood login panel. And it was like little dancing lights around like your username and login. But if you just typed in like admin as the username and hacker, it just bypassed all login and got you into the app. Like,
oh God.
Yeah.
What? Okay. So then what's the best? Do you think the one that was well done?
It's not a movie, but I think Mr. Robot was really well done.
Okay. Okay. That's fair.
I haven't seen a lot of the other stuff like Halt and Catch Fire. A bunch of friends like that. I haven't seen it yet. It's up in my queue. But like, I watched the first season of Mr. Robot and I was like, oh, they definitely were talking to some people who are in computer security here.
Yeah, that one, I remember watching the first season of that and was like, oh yeah, they have their consults are really good on this.
Yeah.
I've got another question from Brad. This one is, in the context of Git eventually coming along and supplanting Subversion, as someone who worked closely on a major project used throughout the open source community like SVN, what did it feel like to see what was basically the next generation version of your work come along and become more prominent?
I think my disappointment with it, I was certainly disappointed. Let's be honest. My disappointment stemmed from a different place than most people would think. One is that the user interface for Git is just terrifyingly bad. Like I often say half jokingly, maybe a third jokingly, that you should never let kernel programmers write userland software because it's like a Gatling gun that just like randomly shoots at different people, and you're going to blow your foot off like once a week with it. And people have built sort of guardrails around it and wrappers and things like that. But the other thing that really concerned me was the fact with distributed version control, it's really easy to hide in a cave. It's especially for younger people who are learning. And Ben and I wrote about this in debugging teams. If you do all your work and then don't share it with someone because you can just like commit it all locally, and then you can rebase and basically just burp out your perfect finished product and share it with the rest of your team, you're more likely to not share more often enough so that you can like get ongoing feedback. And 2, you're likely to make mistakes that you don't have to make. But 3, like people make mistakes all the time. Like just don't be afraid to show your work, kind of a thing. And so those were the big concerns. But beyond that, like beyond a certain point, I think Subversion actually didn't meet the needs. It continued to be centralized. It was still built on the repository. Now, I haven't looked at it since 2007. It was the last time I worked on Subversion. But at the time, the repository was still built in this data structure that I didn't think fit what they really needed to do proper merge tracking and some of the features that they needed to move forward. So I'm glad that something better is out there tool wise. Personally, and for a lot of my pet projects, I've used Mercurial for a long time because it actually had a very good interface, and I liked it a great deal. But GitHub did a great job of basically building an ecosystem and a support structure around Git, and so I'm totally fine with it now. I'm glad that I will say I'm glad I was part of what enabled the world to get to Git, because I was the person who finally shipped CVS to SVN, which was the thing that converted millions and millions and millions of lines of code from the old CVS system to Subversion. But once you got it out of CVS into Subversion, then you could take it anywhere. But CVS was such a janky piece of crap. I actually gave talks about this piece of software. It was called Making Apples from Applesauce, because CVS was such a mess that by analyzing it and running, a dozen passes through it to get it into Subversion, I could actually tell you information about your data that you couldn't find out from CVS because it didn't version operations. But I could basically window box these things and say, oh, well, this operation must have happened in here, so we'll just bisect that and drop it in. So I'm glad we got people into that we wound up in the end with a tool that's much more usable. But I still do worry about people sort of hiding their work and being afraid to share as much.
Well, there's a one universal for, we run foo on Git and on GitHub with the LDS stuff and all that. One of the things that I've found is that everybody who uses Git on the reg has a Post-it note or a note document someplace with here are the commands to use when you fuck it up really bad. Yeah. Yeah. and everybody's commands are a little bit different. Yep. You can do so much and so many different ways that there's an inconsistency that's challenging for certain types of people. So I totally get that. I think people you can say a lot about command line software, but this is something that I actually spent a lot of time on when I was working on Subversion, for a consistency and a smart command line syntax that people could actually remember, get help with, etc. I'm no great designer when it comes to web stuff, even though I've been doing web stuff for the past 5 years at Tock. But when it came to command line stuff, I really put a lot of thought into the design of that command line. Brad says, last question, not to put you on the spot, but would you come back again sometime? I'd love to pick your brain for an awfully long time.
Absolutely. I really enjoy chatting with you. This is super fun. It's just like having a chance to catch up with you and nerd out about stuff.
Well, look, that's the joke I often see is that the podcast is an excuse for middle-aged white men to have meaningful conversations with each other. So, there you go. Fitz, this is an opportunity for you to plug some stuff. Tock obviously is awesome.
Yeah, thanks. That's what I've been doing for the last 5 years. I left Google to start Tock with Nick Kokonis, and it's a weird world we're in right now with COVID-19 and everything. But we basically, when we started working at home, our team sat down and said, "Well, restaurants are closing globally, and we're a system that helps restaurants book. What can we do to help these restaurants?"
You should explain what Tock does normally before, I think, because I bet a lot of people don't know.
So Tock, exploretalk.com. We are a booking system. Some people will say like OpenTable, and I would say, yeah, except it doesn't suck. We're basically a modern version of a booking system for restaurants where we do everything a restaurant needs, which up until 2 months ago included things like regular reservations that cost $0, events, prepaid dinners, prefix dinners where you pay for the whole meal before, deposits where you can pay part of the meal before, add-ons where you can choose like a wine pairing or a truffle supplement or, a cookbook.
Cheese course.
By the chef, cheese course, that kind of thing beforehand. And so that's what we're doing. And also a whole lot of really good software to help the restaurant manage everything better. A complex customer relationship management software that would allow you to remember that, this person's left-handed, they drink sparkling water, their spouse's name is Steve, their anniversary is this, etc. So you basically keep information about your regulars and give them better treatment, because the days of there being a single maitre d' that remembers everyone are long gone, effectively. And so this is what we started doing in December of 2014. I've got a fantastic product team that is doing amazing work. It's a beautiful piece of software too, if you've ever used it. But when basically every restaurant in the world shut down in the course of a week, we said, well, what do we do? What can we do to help these restaurants with the software we have? And my team worked literally for like 5 days straight and burped out a thing called Tock to Go, which is also does delivery and pickup now. So we do all that stuff plus delivery and pickup. And the cool thing about that is most delivery or pickup services are the kind of thing where you get on the phone or you pull up your app and you order it and it shows up as soon as possible, right? Mm-hmm. And that might be 25 minutes, but if it were super slammed, it might be an hour and a half, which tends to get into like, oh, this sucks, I'm really hungry territory. But our system's all about time slots. And so we basically allow a restaurant to say, yeah, I can do up to 20 meals every 15 minutes from 5 o'clock to 9 o'clock. But between 7 and 8, I can do 25 meals because we're really going to push hard. And so people can book in advance. So if it's like it's Friday morning and I'm like, oh, hey, I want to order from, Loyalist tonight and get a burger. Yeah, what time do you want to pick it up? Oh, I'll pick it up at 7. 7's already sold out. 6:30 is already sold out. I'll pick it up at 6:15. That's cool. And so the restaurant, you talk about flattening the curve, this peak that hits like at 7 o'clock, you get to push that down and say, this is as much as our kitchen can handle, and then push it out to the shoulders so that you can actually give more people meals. You can do more business with fewer people in the restaurant, which is important because they're having to space things out right now. So, anyway, we launched that mid-March, and it's been just a roller coaster ever since trying to get more restaurants onto this. So, yeah,
it's interesting because when I don't remember if it was you or Nick that pitched me on the original idea for Tock at ORD Camp 4 or 5 years ago. But Nick is a restaurateur who owns the Alinea Group, in Chicago, and like this seemed, whereas the people I know that work with OpenTable describe it as something that they have to do to remain in business. Like you guys took this from both a customer, a diner perspective, but also from the restaurant perspective to build something that's useful and good. And like you started out with prefix menus. So that, and I think it was Nick was telling me about this, was the idea was that you could get, if you know that Wednesday night is always thin, you have the same number of people at the restaurant on Wednesday night, working at the restaurant on Wednesday night as you do on Saturday or Friday. So you're paying those people regardless. Your cost is the same. The only thing you're not spending on is the extra food that's going out on the tables that night. But if you can get more people into the restaurants on those nights, even if it means reducing your price on the less in demand nights, then you could do like prefixes on Wednesday nights and make more money for the restaurant, have more people eating your food, and it was a good experience for everybody all the way around. It seems like this is a natural extension of that from for the challenging times that we face right now.
Absolutely. I mean, that's where Nick did actually give a talk about this at our camp. I think it would have been 6 years ago, because some of my current employees, some of my current engineers actually had gone to that talk. And then they're working with me today. But yeah, originally it came about because two things. One, no shows. Even restaurants that have more demand than they have availability still have no shows. And it's not just, a table of 4 doesn't show up at all. It's a table of 4 shows up as 3. And I will say this, there are these people out there who I would call monsters who book tables of 4 for 2 people just because they want more space. Oh, you're basically depriving a restaurant of revenue because you want to be more comfortable in a restaurant. Well, it's not going to be a problem going forward because you're going to get more space. But the second thing is that variable pricing thing you pointed out is that so many people want to go on a Friday or a Saturday night, but not as many people want to go on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. So just like if you go to a ball game and you're sitting right behind home plate, paying $300, people don't sit there and look back up in the seats way up in the second upper deck and say, God, I can't believe this guy's only paid $70. Yeah. Nobody's sitting there crying over that. And so the thought was, well, if there's the same thing with demand in a restaurant, let's raise prices a little bit on Friday and Saturday at 7 and 8, but then lower prices on Tuesday and Wednesday. And what that came out with is the system where you start to, again, that curve, that peak curve, you spread it out and you fill the restaurant more. And another thing you said is the real thing that brought me to want to create Tock with Nick wasn't that I wasn't happy at Google. I was having a blast at Google. The fact is that the idea, the original concept of Tock is something that's good for both the guests and the restaurants. So we agreed early on that if we can align our business model with keeping the guests and the restaurants happy, then we've got a recipe for success versus a lot of systems that we saw out there that were just like, oh, we're going to build this concierge service to help, rich dudes that forgot to make a booking. They can pay an extra $50 and get a table that they wanted Friday at 5 or 7 o'clock, which doesn't help the restaurant at all. It doesn't help 99.9% of the world. And so that's what sort of brought us along to this. And it's been really exciting to see how it's evolved because like there's so many different ways a restaurant could be booked, because if you've got high demand 7 days a week, great, then you can do all sorts of stuff. Most restaurants don't have that.
Yeah.
Most restaurants that are open have high demand on a Friday and a Saturday. Great. How can we push some of that off to non-peak times and leverage like that demand to create something better for the guests? And the last thing is, by dealing with no-shows appropriately, you wind up with this thing where people that want to get in the restaurant can, and the people that are going to screw you over can't. The people that make 2 or 3 reservations on a Tuesday and then decide where to go last minute on a Friday. So
God, people really do that? That's
absolutely horrible. Yeah. And so the thing is that most restaurants treat every one of their guests like they're a deadbeat, when really it's only 15 to 20%. So the stuff that we have allows you basically to keep your book open for the people that are committed to showing up, and then weed out the deadbeats. So it's an anti-deadbeat software.
Fitz, if people want to find you on Twitter, where can they do that?
I am on Twitter at TheRealFitz.
Very good. This is the part of the show where I usually talk to Brad about the Patreon, but I'm just going to talk about it a little bit myself. We have at great after an extended conversation, we've added one more new channel to the Patreon, to the Discord, which you can get if you subscribe at the $2 a month level. And it is called Code. It's because the NAS channel was getting clogged up with people talking about Linux programming. So that's there. We've got the food channel has been popping off. I talked about my maker, the project that my daughter and I made for Mother's Day tomorrow. Yesterday, we made it over the last week, but we've been talking about it in the Maker channel. It's an incredible resource. Somebody this morning came to me with a Mister question. Do you know what the Mister is, Fitz? You'll like this.
I do not.
It's a FPGA based emulation device that emulates everything probably up to the PlayStation era. The PlayStation era is not there yet.
What?
But it uses FPGAs to physically mimic, actually mimic the circuitry in SNES's, Genesis's, TurboGrafx, Capcom, the CFS arcade boards, some old arcade boards, stuff like that. So you can actually play, as my favorite example is that the Genesis shipped with different audio chips in different regions and different versions of the hardware. So you can actually get the Genesis audio chip that you grew up with, and have the bleeps and bloops sound exactly like you want.
I love it.
So yeah, he messaged me with a Mr. question. I was like, I don't know the answer to this because I don't have mine yet, but you can hit the Discord and someone there will have the answer. He's like, I was helped within like 5 minutes. So it's a wonderful community. It's like people are incredibly knowledgeable about a bunch of things. You can get access to them if you sign up for the Patreon. And our first subscriber exclusive episode went up last week as well, where Brad and I talked about the plan for this month, including talking to people like Fitz. So you can find that at patreon.com/techpod. And if you don't want to sub to the Patreon, tell like 3 friends about the podcast. That's all we ask. We want you to tell your friends about this thing that we make, and appreciate everybody who's listening, everybody who's backing the show. As always, we want to thank our executive producer level patrons. These folks make the podcast possible every month, along with everybody on the Patreon. Andrew Cotton, David Allen, and Jacob Chappell. Thank you so much for supporting the show. And we will be back next week with another episode. Thanks for coming by, Fitz. This was awesome.
It's my pleasure. Good to see you. Thanks a lot.